Music swelled over the clinking of crystal flutes, suffocating the grand ballroom in manufactured joy. Chantal sat at table 42, nursing watered-down champagne, entirely invisible. Until the man in the bespoke charcoal suit slid into the empty chair beside her. He didn't ask for her name. He didn't offer a polite smile. He just checked a silver watch, leaned close enough for her to smell sandalwood and faint gunpowder, and whispered, "Pretend you're my wife and dance with me." Champagne always tasted like battery acid when you were the pity invite. Chantal adjusted the strap of her thrifted navy dress. It dug into her shoulder, a constant itchy reminder that she didn't belong here. The ballroom of the Astor Hotel was a sea of silk, diamonds, and generational wealth. Chantal was none of those things. She was a 28-year-old mother of a toddler who was currently at home in a cramped apartment, eating boxed mac and cheese under the watchful eye of a teenage babysitter she could barely afford. She was only here because the bride was her cousin, Jessica. Family obligation was a heavy chain. Table 42 was shoved so far into the corner it was practically in the kitchen. Every time the swinging doors opened, Chantal got a draft of roasted garlic and the shouted curses of the sous chef. The other chairs at her table remained conspicuously empty. The singles table. The cast-offs. Chantal checked her phone. 8:14 p.m. If she stayed another 40 minutes, she could leave without causing a scandal. She took a sip of the cheap sparkling wine and watched the dance floor. Couples swayed under a massive chandelier that looked heavy enough to crush them all. Then the air shifted. It wasn't a breeze. It was a change in the room's atmospheric pressure. A man walked through the arched double doors at the far end of the hall. He didn't stroll. He didn't mingle. He moved with the calculated predatory grace of someone who owned the concrete he walked on. He wore a dark charcoal suit that caught the low light, tailored perfectly to a broad, heavy-set frame. His hair was dark, trimmed short at the sides. His jaw was a hard, unforgiving line. Chantal noticed him because he was the only thing in the room that felt real. Everyone else was laughing too loud, smiling too wide. This man wasn't smiling at all. He stopped near the edge of the dance floor. His dark eyes swept the room. They weren't looking for a friend. They were cataloging exits, assessing threats. Chantal looked away, suddenly feeling entirely too exposed despite her corner table. She stared down at her phone screen, tapping it awake just to have something to look at. A chair scraped against the carpet. Chantal blinked. The man in the charcoal suit was sitting beside her. Up close, he was terrifying. He didn't look like a wedding guest. He looked like the kind of man who made people disappear. There was a faint jagged scar cutting through the edge of his left eyebrow. His hands, resting flat on the white tablecloth, were large and scarred. "Don't look at the doors," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly scrape. It barely carried over the jazz band, but it demanded absolute obedience. Chantal froze. "Excuse me?" 3 men just walked in, black suits, red ties. "Do not look at them." He didn't look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the centerpieces, his jaw clenched tight. Chantal's heart did a strange, painful stutter. She was cynical, tired, and deeply familiar with the ugly side of life, but this was out of her depth. "I think you have the wrong table." "I have exactly the right table." He shifted his weight, leaning in. The scent of him washed over her. Clean soap, expensive cedar, and something metallic. Gunpowder. Blood? Chantal's stomach plummeted. "Get up," he ordered quietly. "No?" The word slipped out before her brain could stop it. Chantal was a mother. She spent her days negotiating with a fiercely stubborn 3-year-old, and her nights fending off predatory landlords. She didn't do well with orders. The man finally turned his head. His eyes were the color of black coffee, flat and devoid of warmth. For a split second, something resembling surprise flickered in them. "I have $50 in my purse and a kid at home," Chantal said, her voice shaking but her chin tipped up. "I don't know who you are, but I'm not getting involved in whatever this is." "I don't want your money," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching downward. He glanced over her shoulder. The tension rolling off him was suffocating. "Those men are looking for me. If they find me, they start shooting. If they start shooting, the people in this room get caught in the crossfire, including you." Chantal stopped breathing. He stood up, offering his large, scarred hand. "Pretend you're my wife," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. "And dance with me." Survival instinct was a funny thing. It bypassed logic, ignored pride, and hijacked the nervous system. Chantal placed her hand in his fingers closed around hers. They were rough, calloused, and uncomfortably warm. He pulled her up with zero effort, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm. "Smile," he murmured. Chantal bared her teeth in something that felt like a grimace. "If I get shot in this cheap dress, my ghost will haunt you." A sharp exhale escaped his nose. It might have been a laugh, but she couldn't be sure. He guided her away from the shadows of table 42 and straight into the blinding glare of the dance floor. The jazz band had just transitioned into a slow, mournful ballad. He turned to face her. His right hand went to her waist, his grip firm and possessive. His left hand held hers, pressing it flat against his chest. Beneath the silk shirt and tailored wool, Chantal felt the heavy, rigid shape of a shoulder holster. She swallowed hard. "You brought a gun to a wedding." "I bring a gun everywhere," he replied, steering her smoothly into the center of the crowd. He moved well for a big man, silent, fluid. "Keep your head down, rest it on my shoulder." "We just met," she hissed, stiffening her spine. His fingers dug slightly into her hip. A warning. "They are by the ice sculpture, scanning the tables. If we look like a bored married couple, we're invisible. Do it." Chantal exhaled a shaky breath. She let her forehead drop against his collarbone. The fabric of his suit scratched against her cheek. She could hear his heartbeat. It was maddeningly slow, steady. The rhythm of a man completely devoid of fear. "Who are they?" she asked, keeping her voice muffled against his lapel. "Business associates. We had a disagreement over a shipping route." "A shipping route?" Chantal rolled her eyes against his chest. "Let me guess. You import olive oil?" "Something like that." He spun her gently, putting his own back to the ice sculpture, shielding her body with his. Chantal peeked through the gaps in the dancing couples. She saw them. 3 men, built like brick walls, wearing identical, ill-fitting black suits and garish red ties. They were shoving past the waitstaff, their eyes darting rapidly across the seated guests. They looked angry. They looked lethal. Chantal's hands started to tremble. She thought of her son, Leo. He would be asleep by now, his favorite ragged stuffed bear tucked under his chin. If she didn't come home tonight, her sister wouldn't take him. He would end up in the system. The thought hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The man holding her felt the shift. He felt the tremor running through her arms. "Breathe," he said. It wasn't an order this time. It was quieter, almost grounding. "If I die here, my son has no one," she whispered fiercely into his jacket. "I am a single mother. I work 2 jobs. I don't have time for a mob shootout." He went entirely still for a fraction of a second, missing a beat of the music. Then his hand moved from her waist, sliding up the center of her back. He pressed her closer, a heavy, solid anchor in the middle of a spinning room. "You aren't going to die," he said. His voice was a low rumble in his chest. "I won't let them touch you. That's a promise." "I don't trust men who make promises," Chantal replied bitterly. Her ex-husband had made plenty right before he drained their bank account and moved to Florida. "Smart girl." He tilted his head, his lips brushing against her hair in a mock display of affection for anyone watching. "But I'm not most men. Name's Dooley. Dooley Graham." Chantal closed her eyes. Even she knew that name. You couldn't live in this city, read the papers, or pay protection money to neighborhood street bosses without hearing the name Graham. He was the head of the syndicate, a ghost, a monster who allegedly ran the Eastern Seaboard's underground empire. She was slow dancing with the devil. "Chantal," she breathed. "Chantal Edwards." "Well, Chantal Edwards," Dooley said, stepping perfectly in time with the music. "You smell like vanilla and exhaustion. It's a good cover, very domestic. I'm going to bill you for dry cleaning. I'm sweating through this dress. Send the invoice to my office." They swayed for another 2 minutes. To Chantal, it felt like 2 decades. Every rustle of silk, every clink of a glass sounded like the rack of a shotgun. But Dooley kept her moving, kept her hidden in plain sight. They drifted toward the edge of the dance floor, near the French doors that opened out onto the terrace. "They're moving toward the kitchens," Dooley murmured, his gaze fixed on the reflection in the glass doors. "They think I slipped out the back." "Did you?" "My car is out front. The valet has it running." The music swelled to a close. Dooley stopped moving. He didn't let go of her right away. He stood there for a moment, looking down at her. Chantal looked back. She didn't cower. She didn't bat her eyelashes. She looked at him with the raw, unfiltered exhaustion of a woman who had survived a different kind of war every single day of her life. Dooley's jaw tightened. He released her slowly, as if breaking a magnetic pull. "Stay here for 5 minutes," he instructed. "Go to the bathroom, call a cab, go home to your son." He reached into his inner breast pocket. Chantal tensed, expecting the gun. Instead, he pulled out a thick silver money clip. He slid a crisp, folded $100 bill from the stack and pressed it into her palm. "For the cab," he said, "and the dry cleaning." Chantal looked at the money. It was a week's worth of groceries. It was a new pair of winter boots for Leo. She shoved it back into his chest. "I said I don't want your money. I did it so I wouldn't get shot. We're even." Dooley Graham stared at the crumpled bill against his expensive shirt. He looked genuinely baffled. People didn't refuse his money. People didn't talk back to him, and they certainly didn't do it while wearing scuffed heels and a dress from a discount rack. He slowly lowered his hand, pocketing the cash. A dark, dangerous amusement flickered in his eyes. "Even," he repeated softly. He turned on his heel and walked out the French doors into the cool night air, swallowed by the darkness instantly. Chantal stood alone on the edge of the dance floor, her heart hammering against her ribs, her palm still burning where his skin had touched hers. 3 days passed. The wedding faded into a bizarre, adrenaline-soaked memory. Chantal convinced herself she had hallucinated half of it. Real life was loud, demanding, and thoroughly unglamorous. "Mommy, the dinosaur broke his leg!" Leo wailed, holding up a plastic T-Rex missing its left limb. Chantal knelt on the linoleum floor of their tiny kitchen, scrubbing a stubborn tomato sauce stain off the counter. She pushed a stray strand of dull brown hair out of her eyes and sighed. "Bring him here, buddy. We'll do surgery." Leo trotted over, his mop of curls bouncing. She took the dinosaur, found the missing leg under the radiator, and jammed it back into the socket with a sharp snap. "He's cured," Chantal declared, handing it back. Leo grinned, displaying a missing front tooth, and ran back to the living room, roaring. Chantal leaned against the cheap laminate counter, closing her eyes. She was exhausted. Her shift at the diner had run late. Her feet throbbed, and she was 3 weeks behind on rent. The landlord, a slimy man named Mr. Henderson, had left 2 voicemails that morning. The second one had sounded vaguely threatening. She opened her eyes and looked at the stack of bills sitting on the rickety kitchen table. They mocked her. Final notice. Past due. She thought about the $100 bill Dooley Graham had tried to hand her. Pride was a stupid, expensive luxury. She should have taken the money. She could have fed Leo fresh fruit this week instead of canned peaches. A heavy, deliberate knock sounded at the front door. Chantal froze. It wasn't the frantic staccato rapping of her neighbor, Mrs. Gable, coming to complain about the noise. It was 3 solid, spaced-out thuds. "Mr. Henderson." Chantal wiped her hands on her jeans, squared her shoulders, and walked to the door. She unlocked the deadbolt and pulled it open, ready to unleash a rehearsed speech about tenant rights and grace periods. The words died in her throat. It wasn't Mr. Henderson. Standing in the dimly lit hallway of her decrepit apartment building was a man in a sharp, tailored navy suit. It wasn't Dooley. This man was younger, leaner, with sharp cheekbones and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked like an accountant, except for the distinct heavy bulge beneath his jacket and the dead-eyed stare. Chantal stepped back, her hand flying to the doorframe, ready to slam it shut. "Chantal Edwards?" the man asked. His voice was polite, mild. It terrified her. "Who's asking?" she demanded, keeping her body angled to block any view of the living room where Leo was playing. "My name is Paul. I work for Mr. Graham." Cold dread pooled in her stomach. "I don't know a Mr. Graham." Paul didn't blink. He reached into his pocket. Chantal flinched, but he only pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He held it out to her. "Mr. Graham insists on settling his debts. He considers the events of Saturday night an unpaid tab." "I told him we were even," Chantal said, refusing to touch the envelope. "I don't want his money. I don't want his attention. Tell him to leave me alone." Paul's expression remained perfectly blank. "Mr. Graham does not like to be indebted. He also requested I inform you that your landlord, Mr. Henderson, has decided to waive your rent for the next 6 months. Apparently, he had a sudden change of heart regarding the building's maintenance issues." Chantal stared at him, her mouth slightly open. "What did you do to him?" "Nothing," Paul said smoothly. "We merely had a conversation about civic responsibility. The envelope, Ms. Edwards." He stepped forward, closing the distance. He didn't threaten her, but the sheer presence of the man forced Chantal to take the envelope. It was heavy, thicker than a single bill. "Mr. Graham also extends an invitation," Paul continued. "He would like you to join him for dinner tomorrow night. 8 o'clock. A car will be sent." Chantal let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Dinner? Is this a joke? I'm a waitress. I have a kid. I don't go on dates with mobsters." "It isn't a date, Ms. Edwards. It is a business proposition. Mr. Graham requires a favor." Paul gave a short, precise nod. "Have a pleasant evening." He turned and walked down the hallway, his footsteps silent on the cheap carpet. Chantal slammed the door, locking the deadbolt and chaining it. Her hands were shaking violently. She leaned against the wood, breathing hard. "Mommy, who was that?" Leo peeked his head around the corner, holding his plastic dinosaur. "No one, baby, just a salesman," Chantal lied, forcing a gentle smile. She walked over to the kitchen table and ripped open the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check made out to her name. It wasn't $100. It was 10,000. Beneath the check was a heavy, embossed business card. It had one word printed on it in elegant black ink, Graham, and handwritten on the back in sharp, aggressive cursive. "Bring the dress, D." Chantal stared at the check. It was a lifeline. It was a trap. It was the exact amount she needed to pay off her debts, put Leo in a decent preschool, and breathe for the first time in 3 years. She knew how these things worked. You took Mafia money, you belonged to the Mafia. Dooley Graham wasn't playing fairy godmother. He wanted something. He had seen a desperate, cynical woman at a wedding who knew how to keep her mouth shut and follow orders under pressure, and he had decided she was useful. She looked at Leo. He was banging the dinosaur against the coffee table, laughing at his own noise. Chantal slowly set the check down on the table. She walked into her tiny bedroom, opened the closet, and looked at the cheap navy blue dress hanging on the back of the door. It still smelled faintly of expensive cedar and gunpowder. She reached out and touched the fabric. "Okay, Dooley," she whispered into the empty room. "Let's see what you want." The black Lincoln Town car smelled like lemon polish and expensive leather. It was completely silent in the back seat. Chantal stared out the tinted window, watching the neon blur of the city slide past. She had left Leo with Mrs. Gable, telling the elderly woman she was picking up an extra shift at a high-end catering gig. It wasn't entirely a lie. She was definitely catering to a very specific, dangerous demographic. Paul drove. He hadn't spoken a single word since opening the door for her outside her apartment building. Chantal smoothed the skirt of the navy dress. It was clean, pressed, and entirely inadequate for wherever she was going. The $10,000 cashier's check was folded perfectly into a square and tucked inside her cheap clutch. It felt like a brick against her ribs. The car glided to a halt in an alleyway behind a discreet brick building. No signage, no windows, just a heavy steel door bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a sodium street lamp. Paul killed the engine. He stepped out, opened Chantal's door, and gestured toward the entrance. Chantal swallowed the metallic taste of fear in her mouth. She stepped onto the damp asphalt, clutching her purse tight enough to turn her knuckles white, and walked toward the door. It opened before she reached it, held by a man built like a cargo van. He didn't look at her, just nodded at Paul. Inside, the atmosphere shifted drastically. It wasn't a mobster's warehouse. It was a restaurant. Dimly lit, smelling intensely of roasting garlic, expensive wine, and old wood. White tablecloths gleamed under low-hanging amber pendants, and it was completely empty, except for one table in the back. Dooley Graham sat in a leather booth, nursing a glass of amber liquid. He wasn't wearing a suit tonight. He wore a black button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing thick forearms corded with muscle and faded ink. He looked less like a corporate shark and more like a street brawler who had managed to buy his way indoors. He didn't stand when she approached. He just pointed to the chair across from him. "Sit," he said. Chantal sat. She kept her purse in her lap, a flimsy shield against a man who could probably break the heavy oak table in half with his bare hands. "You wore the dress," he observed. His dark eyes flicked over her, cold and calculating. "You asked me to," Chantal replied. Her voice wavered slightly, and she hated herself for it. She cleared her throat. "I brought your check. I'm not cashing it until I know what you want. I don't work blind." Dooley took a slow sip of his drink. Ice clinked against the crystal. "Pragmatic. I like that. Most people would have cashed the check and booked a flight to Mexico. Most people don't have a 3-year-old who needs stability." Chantal pulled the folded check from her clutch and placed it flat on the tablecloth between them. "So, the favor?" Dooley leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The casual posture didn't soften him. It made him look like a predator settling in for a meal. "I am currently negotiating the acquisition of a logistics network," Dooley said, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly register that commanded absolute attention. "The current owner is a man named Arthur Pendleton. Old money, deeply entrenched in local politics. He despises organized crime. He refuses to sell his company to a thug." "Are you?" Chantal asked, matching his gaze. "A thug?" A muscle jumped in his jaw. "I am a businessman who occasionally uses blunt force trauma to balance the ledger. Pendleton doesn't care about the money. He cares about optics. He wants to sell to a family man, someone respectable, someone with ties to the community. He wants a legacy, not a bloody takeover." Chantal stared at him. The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. "You want me to pretend to be your wife?" "Fiancé," Dooley corrected. "Wife requires paperwork. Fiancé only requires a ring and a good performance. I need Pendleton to see me as a domesticated man looking to build a legitimate future for his new family." "This is insane." Chantal let out a short, breathless laugh. "You can hire an actress. You can hire an escort. Why me? Because an actress will overact, and an escort will panic the second one of my rivals looks at her wrong," Dooley said bluntly. "I watched you on Saturday. 3 armed men walked into that room to kill me. You didn't scream. You didn't run. You calculated the odds, decided compliance was your best chance of survival, and you played your part perfectly. You aren't fragile, Chantal. I am a waitress, Dooley. I serve lukewarm coffee to truck drivers. You're a survivor." He reached out and tapped a thick finger against the cashier's check. "This covers your debts. You play my fiancé for the next 2 months. You attend dinners. You smile at Pendleton. You let me hold your hand in public. When the ink dries on the contract, you walk away. I give you another $200,000. Chantal stopped breathing. $200,000! It was a house in a safe neighborhood. It was Leo's college fund. It was the end of Mr. Henderson, the end of late notices, the end of the bone-deep exhaustion that dictated every choice she made. "And if your business associates from the wedding decide to come back?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "They won't. They are no longer a concern," Dooley said smoothly. He didn't elaborate. Chantal didn't want him to. "If I do this," Chantal said, her nails biting into her palms, "I have terms. Leo stays out of it, completely. He never meets you. He never comes to your world." "Agreed." "I need a bodyguard for him while I'm at these events. Someone discreet, not one of your goons." "Paul will handle it personally," Dooley said. Chantal looked at the check on the table. It was the devil's bargain. But the devil was sitting across from her, offering her a way out of poverty, and God had been notably silent on the issue of her rent. She reached out and pulled this check back toward her. Dooley's lips curved into a faint, dangerous smile. "Welcome to the family, Chantal." The transformation was clinical. 3 days after the meeting at the restaurant, Paul arrived at Chantal's apartment with 4 garment bags, a velvet jewelry box, and a dossier. "Mr. Graham prefers understated elegance," Paul stated, unzipping the bags to reveal silk sheaths, tailored blazers, and dark, dramatic evening gowns. "No bright colors, no excessive skin. You are playing the role of a refined, grounding influence." Chantal stood in the center of her cramped living room, feeling entirely disconnected from her own body. She flipped through the dossier. It contained Dooley's public biography, charities he allegedly supported, hobbies he supposedly enjoyed. "He plays the cello?" Chantal asked, raising an eyebrow at Paul. "No," Paul replied deadpan, "but he sponsors the municipal symphony. If asked, you share his passion for Bach." The hardest part was the ring. Paul opened the velvet box to reveal an emerald-cut diamond flanked by 2 sapphires. It was heavy, cold, and blinding. When Chantal slid it onto her left hand, it felt like a shackle. Their first test was a charity gala hosted by Arthur Pendleton. Chantal sat in the back of the town car, wearing a long black silk dress that clung to her ribs and flared slightly at the ankles. Dooley sat beside her, immaculately dressed in a midnight blue tuxedo. The air in the car was thick with unspoken tension. "You're breathing too fast," Dooley said, not looking up from his phone. "I'm wearing the GDP of a small country on my finger," Chantal snapped, rubbing her temples. "And I'm about to lie to a room full of politicians. Forgive me if I'm not perfectly zen." Dooley locked his phone and put it away. He turned his head to look at her. The streetlights flashed across his face, highlighting the jagged scar on his brow. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Chantal met his gaze. "You don't care about these people," Dooley said, his voice a steady, rhythmic anchor. "They are marks. They are obstacles. You care about Leo. You care about the money waiting for you at the end of this. When you walk into that room, you aren't Chantal the waitress. You are Chantal, the woman who tamed Dooley Graham. Act like you own the ground you walk on, and they will believe you." He reached over and took her left hand, his thumb brushing over the massive diamond. His touch was rough, a stark contrast to the cold perfection of the stone. "Ready?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. "Good. Overconfidence gets people killed." The car doors opened. The flash of paparazzi cameras was instantly blinding. Dooley stepped out first, buttoning his jacket, and then offered his hand. Chantal took a breath, plastered on a serene, practiced smile, and stepped into the light. The gala was a blur of velvet, crystal, and polite, venomous conversation. Dooley never left her side. His hand rested constantly on the small of her back, a possessive, heavy weight. He introduced her to senators, police commissioners, and wealthy socialites. Chantal played her part. She laughed at terrible jokes, sipped sparkling water, and spoke vaguely about her background in freelance consulting. Then they found Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton was a tall, skeletal man with thin white hair and a permanent sneer of superiority. He stood near the ice luge, surrounded by a small court of sycophants. "Dooley," Pendleton said, his tone dripping with forced politeness, "I didn't expect you to make it. I thought you preferred grittier venues." "Arthur," Dooley replied smoothly, ignoring the insult, "I find my tastes are evolving. I'd like you to meet my fiancée, Chantal." Pendleton's pale eyes dragged over Chantal, assessing her worth in a matter of seconds. "A fiancée? How sudden. We hadn't heard you were courting anyone, Graham." "We prefer our privacy," Chantal said, stepping slightly closer to Dooley. She reached out and rested her hand flat against Dooley's chest, exactly where she knew his shoulder holster usually sat. He wasn't wearing it tonight. The absence of the weapon felt strangely intimate. "Dooley works so hard. I try to ensure our private life remains just that." "Private?" Pendleton stared at her hand on Dooley's chest. "And how did you two meet?" "A wedding," Dooley lied effortlessly, his hand sliding to grip Chantal's waist. "I saw her across the room. I sat down beside her, and I knew." "Knew what?" Pendleton challenged. Dooley looked down at Chantal. For a second, the flat, dead look in his eyes vanished. A flicker of something entirely unreadable replaced it, something dark, possessive, and dangerous. "That she wasn't going to let me go," Dooley murmured, the words directed entirely at her. Chantal's breath hitched. She knew it was a performance. She knew he was playing to the audience. But the intensity of his stare burned straight through her practiced calm. She felt a sudden, terrifying heat flush up her neck. Pendleton cleared his throat, suddenly looking uncomfortable. The raw, predatory energy rolling off Dooley was impossible to ignore. "Well, congratulations. Perhaps we should schedule that meeting next week, Dooley. My office. I'll have my people call yours," Dooley said, never taking his eyes off Chantal. The rest of the night passed in a dizzying haze. When they finally returned to the town car, Chantal collapsed back against the leather seat, kicking off her heels the second the doors closed. Dooley loosened his tie, rolling his neck. "You did well." "I lied to the former mayor," Chantal groaned, staring at the ceiling. "I'm going to hell." "I'll save you a seat," Dooley replied dryly. Chantal turned her head to look at him. He looked tired. The harsh lines of his face were drawn tight. She remembered the way he had looked at her in front of Pendleton, the fake affection that had felt terrifyingly real. "Why did you say that?" she asked quietly. "About me not letting you go." Dooley turned his head. The space between them in the back seat suddenly felt incredibly small. "Because, Chantal," he said, his voice barely a rasp, "a man like me doesn't get a woman like you unless she has no other choice." Pendleton needed to believe the delusion. He looked away, staring out the window into the dark. Chantal looked down at the diamond on her finger. It sparkled in the passing streetlights, cold and sharp. She realized with a sudden, sinking dread that playing pretend with a monster was easy. The hard part was going to be pretending she wasn't starting to like the dark. The lie became a second skin. For 3 weeks, Chantal existed in 2 entirely separate universes. By day, she scrubbed dried oatmeal off high-chair trays, negotiated with a fiercely independent toddler about wearing pants, and poured bitter coffee for double shifts at the diner. By night, she slipped into $1,000 dresses, strapped on the heavy sapphire ring, and transformed into the untouchable consort of the city's most dangerous man. The transition was exhausting. The bleed between the 2 worlds was terrifying. It happened on a Tuesday evening. Chantal was at Dooley's penthouse, a sprawling, sterile expanse of glass, steel, and black leather overlooking the skyline. She was there to review the guest list for Pendleton's upcoming charity auction. Paul had set a thick manila folder on the glass dining table and vanished into the depths of the apartment. Chantal kicked off her sneakers, tucked her feet under her on the stiff leather sofa, and started memorizing names and allegiances. Senator Davies takes bribes in offshore accounts, likes his martinis dirty. Mrs. Gable, no, wait, that was her neighbor. Chantal rubbed her burning eyes. The private elevator pinged. The heavy steel doors slid open with a soft shh. Dooley stepped out. He didn't have his usual predatory glide. His steps were heavy, uneven. He was wearing a dark suit, but he had discarded the jacket and tie somewhere. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and his left sleeve was rolled up. His forearm was wrapped in a makeshift tourniquet made from a silk pocket square. The white fabric was soaked through, a harsh, rust-colored stain spreading rapidly. Chantal froze. The manila folder slipped from her lap, hitting the rug with a soft slap. Dooley didn't look at her. He walked straight past the living area toward the kitchen island. His jaw clamped so tight the muscles twitched. He pulled a heavy first aid kit from beneath the counter, set it on the marble top, and gripped the edge of the sink, letting out a slow, ragged exhale. Paul, Dooley grated out, his voice tight with pain. Paul left 10 minutes ago to do the perimeter sweep, Chantal said. Dooley finally snapped his head up, his dark eyes locking onto her. He looked feverish. The pristine, untouchable facade was cracked, exposing the violent reality he usually kept hidden behind tailored wool and closed doors. "Leave," he ordered quietly. "Go to the guest room, shut the door." Chantal didn't move. She looked at the blood dripping from his fingertips onto the white marble. It was a lot of blood. She stood up. She didn't run away, and she didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for people who didn't have to function in a crisis. She had walked Leo through 3 separate emergency room visits for split lips and high fevers. Blood didn't scare her. She walked into the kitchen, shoved her sleeves up, and popped the latches on the heavy plastic first aid kit. "What are you doing?" Dooley demanded, his voice dropping a dangerous octave. He took a half step back, putting space between them. "I'm opening the gauze," Chantal said flatly, pulling out a pair of trauma shears and a bottle of antiseptic. "Unless you'd rather bleed out on your imported Italian marble, your choice." "Chantal, walk away. Sit on the stool, Dooley." He stared at her. It was the same look he had given her at the wedding when she refused his money. Complete, utter bafflement. The men in his world followed orders. The women in his world averted their eyes. Chantal did neither. With a low grunt of frustration, Dooley sank onto one of the metal bar stools. Chantal stepped up to him. Up close, the smell of copper and adrenaline was overpowering. She reached out and took his left arm. His muscles were rigid as iron under her grip. "This is going to sting," she muttered, grabbing the trauma shears. She didn't bother trying to untie the ruined silk square. She just cut right through it. The wound was ugly, a jagged, deep slice across the meat of his forearm. It wasn't a bullet graze, it was a knife wound. "Business negotiation gone bad?" Chantal asked, uncapping the antiseptic. "A disagreement over territorial boundaries," Dooley rasped, staring straight ahead at the stainless steel refrigerator. "A minor faction thought I was getting soft, that my focus was divided." Chantal paused, the bottle hovering over his arm. Divided, he meant her, the fake fiancée, the sudden domesticity. It made him look vulnerable to the wolves. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Don't be. They won't make the mistake again." His tone was devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact that chilled her to the bone. Chantal tipped the bottle. Dooley didn't flinch, didn't make a sound as the harsh chemical burned into the open gash. She worked quickly and efficiently, her movements practiced. She packed the wound with gauze, wrapped it tight with a bandage, and secured it with tape. When she finished, she didn't step back immediately. She kept her hands resting lightly on his bandaged arm, feeling the steady, heavy thud of his pulse beneath the white wrap. Dooley slowly turned his head. His face was mere inches from hers. The manic, violent energy that had followed him out of the elevator was gone, replaced by a suffocating, heavy stillness. He looked at her hands on his arm, then up to her face. His dark eyes mapped her features, the dark circles under her eyes, the messy bun on top of her head, the faded t-shirt she wore. She was miles away from the polished, untouchable woman he paraded in front of Pendleton. "You don't shake," he observed quietly. "I'm a mother," Chantal said, dropping her hands and taking a step back to toss the bloody silk into the trash. "If I shook every time someone bled, I'd never get anything done." "It's not just that." Dooley turned on the stool to face her fully. "You aren't afraid of me. I am terrified of you, Dooley." She met his gaze squarely, refusing to blink. "I'm terrified of this whole thing. I'm terrified of what happens if Pendleton finds out. I'm terrified of the people who did that to your arm. But right now, you were just a guy bleeding on the floor. I can handle a guy bleeding on the floor." Dooley stood up. The height difference was sudden and overwhelming. He towered over her, casting a long, dark shadow across the kitchen. He reached out, his uninjured hand brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered for a fraction of a second against her pulse point. "You are a very dangerous woman, Chantal Edwards," he murmured. Chantal let out a short, humorless laugh. "I'm a waitress." "No," Dooley said, his thumb pressing lightly against her jaw before he pulled his hand away. "You're a survivor, and survivors ruin everything they touch because they refuse to die. Go finish the guest list. Pendleton signs the papers on Friday." He turned and walked down the hallway toward his bedroom, leaving Chantal standing alone in the kitchen, her heart slamming against her ribs, completely unable to tell where the act ended and reality began. Thursday morning brought a cold, biting rain that turned the city streets into gray sludge. Chantal was off from the diner. She was kneeling on the floor of her apartment, trying to duct tape a leak beneath the kitchen sink, while Leo sat at the table, methodically crushing graham crackers into a fine dust. "Leo, please eat the crackers. Don't just murder them," Chantal sighed, wiping a streak of dirty water off her forehead. Someone knocked on the door. It wasn't Paul's polite scheduled double tap. It was a single heavy thud that rattled the cheap wood in its frame. Chantal froze. The duct tape fell from her hands. The memory of the 3 men in the red ties at the wedding flashed behind her eyes. "Mommy dar," Leo announced, covered in cracker crumbs. "I hear it, bug. Stay right there." Chantal stood up slowly. She walked to the counter, her hand wrapping instinctively around the handle of a heavy cast-iron skillet sitting on the stove. She crept toward the door and peered through the scratched peephole. She let out a sharp, shuddering breath and dropped the skillet onto the floor. She unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Dooley stood in the dimly lit hallway. He was wearing a heavy black overcoat, the collar turned up against the damp chill. Water dripped from his dark hair. He looked entirely out of place in her dilapidated building, a wolf standing in a chicken coop. "What are you doing here?" Chantal hissed, keeping her voice low. "We have a rule. You don't come here. Leo is inside." "Paul intercepted a tail," Dooley said. His voice was clipped, strictly business. "One of Pendleton's private investigators. They followed your cab from the diner yesterday. Paul handled it, but I needed to verify the perimeter myself." Chantal's stomach plummeted. "They know where I live? They know Chantal Edwards lives here. They don't know who Chantal Edwards is to me, other than what we've told them." Dooley stepped forward, forcing Chantal to step back into the apartment. He closed the door behind him and locked it. He turned and froze. Leo was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, clutching a half-crushed graham cracker, staring up at the giant man in the black coat. The silence in the room was absolute. Chantal felt a spike of sheer, primal panic. She moved instinctively, stepping between Dooley and her son, acting as a physical shield. "You need to leave," Chantal said, her voice shaking with a sudden, violent intensity. "You promised. He stays out of it." Dooley didn't look at her. He was staring down at the boy. The hard, unforgiving lines of his face didn't soften, but the deadness in his eyes shifted into something sharply observant. He took in the faded hand-me-down clothes, the mop of brown curls, the missing front tooth. "He looks like you," Dooley said quietly. "Dooley, get out." Leo, entirely oblivious to the tension suffocating the room, took a step forward and pointed at Dooley's left arm, which was resting stiffly against his side under the coat. "You got a boo-boo," Leo observed loudly. Dooley's brow furrowed slightly. "A what?" "A boo-boo," Leo repeated, pointing a sticky finger. "Mommy fixes boo-boos. She fixed my dinosaur." Chantal squeezed her eyes shut. "Leo, go back to the table, baby. Mommy's talking to a coworker." Dooley slowly crouched down, his overcoat brushing against the cheap linoleum floor. He brought himself down to Leo's eye level, ignoring Chantal's panicked stance. "Your mommy is very good at fixing things," Dooley said, his gravelly voice surprisingly gentle. "She fixed my arm," Leo nodded sagely. "Did she use the magic Band-Aid, the ones with the stars?" "No," Dooley replied, a tiny, almost imperceptible ghost of a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Just the boring white ones. I'll have to ask for the stars next time." "Okay." Leo seemed satisfied with this negotiation. He shoved the rest of the graham cracker into his mouth and ran back to the kitchen table. Dooley stood up slowly, favoring his left side. He looked at Chantal. She was trembling, her arms wrapped around herself, glaring at him with a mixture of terror and fury. I didn't break the rule, Chantal. He doesn't know who I am. He just thinks I'm a man with a boring white band-aid. You brought your world to my door, Chantal whispered, stepping closer to him so Leah wouldn't hear. Pendleton's men followed me. If they look too close, they'll see I'm nobody. They'll see I'm a fraud. And when this falls apart, you get to retreat to your penthouse with your bodyguards. I get left here with a target on my back. Dooley looked down at her. The amusement from his interaction with Leo was completely gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. It won't fall apart, Dooley said. Pendleton signs the transfer tomorrow night at the gala. Once the ink is dry, he has no leverage. The investigation drops. You get your money and you walk away into the sunset. And if he doesn't sign, he will. Dooley reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. He tossed it onto the small console table by the door. That's the remaining $200,000 in cash. Regardless of what happens tomorrow, you've earned it. Chantal looked at the envelope. It was everything she had fought for. It was freedom. But as she looked back up at Dooley, standing in her cramped hallway, filling the space with his dark, heavy presence, she felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest. The transaction was almost over. The lie was ending. Tomorrow night, Chantal said softly. Wear the red dress, Dooley commanded, his voice dropping slightly, losing the harsh edge of business. Pendleton likes tradition. I like... He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He just looked at her, his dark eyes burning with something unspoken, something that felt far more dangerous than the men in the red ties. He unlocked the door and stepped back out into the cold, damp hallway. I'll send Paul at 7, Dooley said, and closed the door, leaving Chantal alone with the money, the leak under the sink, and a heart that was beating entirely out of rhythm. The red dress wasn't just a garment. It was armor. It was heavy, crimson silk that clung to Chantal's curves and pooled around her ankles like spilled wine. When she stepped out of her apartment building into the bitter evening wind, Paul was waiting by the open door of the town car. He didn't say a word, but his eyes dropped to the pavement in a rare display of deference before he gestured for her to get in. Dooley was already inside. When Chantal slid into the leather seat, the air in the cabin seemed to vanish. Dooley turned his head. He wore a stark black tuxedo, severe and flawless, the white of his shirt glowing in the dim light. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the practiced icy composure he wore like a second skin cracked. A muscle flexed wildly in his jaw. His gaze dropped from her bare shoulders to the slit in the silk over her thigh and back up to her eyes. Pendleton is a dead man if he looks at you too long, Dooley murmured. It wasn't a compliment. It was a threat, delivered with absolute chilling sincerity. Just get the papers signed, Chantal said, staring straight ahead. Her voice sounded brittle. I want this over. Dooley didn't reply. He reached across the center console and took her left hand, threading his fingers through hers. His grip was entirely too tight. The gala was held at Pendleton's private estate, a sprawling stone mansion outside the city limits. The driveway was packed with imported luxury cars. Security was tight, composed of men with earpieces and bulging jackets who looked at Dooley with thinly veiled panic as he walked through the front doors. They didn't go to the ballroom. They didn't mingle. A butler escorted them up a wide mahogany staircase, down a corridor lined with somber oil paintings, and into a private study overlooking the manicured grounds. Arthur Pendleton sat behind a massive desk. He didn't stand when they entered. Two of his own security men stood in the shadows near the bookshelves. "Dooley," Pendleton said, steepling his thin fingers, "and the lovely Chantal. Please, sit." Dooley didn't sit. He walked to the center of the room, pulling Chantal with him, keeping her slightly behind his right shoulder. "The transfer documents, Arthur," Dooley said. His voice was flat, devoid of any social pleasantry. Pendleton smiled. It didn't reach his pale eyes. "Always in a rush. I have the papers right here. But before I sign away a 40-year legacy, I want to clarify a minor detail." Pendleton opened a manila folder on his desk. He pulled out a stack of glossy photographs and tossed them onto the polished wood. Chantal's heart stopped. They were pictures of her. Chantal in her faded winter coat, carrying a plastic grocery bag. Chantal standing outside the diner, smoking a cigarette she had bummed off the line cook. Chantal arguing with Mr. Henderson in the hallway of her crumbling apartment building. "My investigator had a very busy week," Pendleton said, leaning back in his chair. "Chantal Edwards, a diner waitress, 2 months behind on rent, up until a very sudden, very generous deposit was made into her account. A single mother to a boy with no listed father. You expect me to believe this is the woman taming the great Dooley Graham? She's a prop, a rented distraction." The silence in the room was absolute. Chantal felt the blood drain from her face. The lie was exposed. The deal was dead. She waited for Dooley's fury, for the violence that always hovered just beneath his surface to erupt. Dooley didn't draw a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He slowly reached down and picked up the photograph of Chantal outside the diner. He stared at it for a long, quiet moment. "You're right, Arthur," Dooley said softly. Chantal flinched, the admission hitting her like a physical blow. She tried to pull her hand away from his, ready to run, but his grip turned into a vice. He didn't let her go. "She is a waitress," Dooley continued, dropping the photo back onto the desk. He finally looked at Pendleton, and the darkness in his eyes was absolute. "She raised a son on tips and stale bread. She fought off landlords and fought for every breath she took in a city that tried to crush her. And she did it without a silver spoon, without an inheritance, and without breaking." Dooley pulled Chantal forward, stepping flush against her side, a solid, immovable wall of heat and tailored wool. "She is twice the man you are, Arthur," Dooley stated, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "And if you ever put a camera on her or her son again, I won't buy your company. I will burn it to the ground with you inside it. Now, sign the papers." Pendleton stared at Dooley. The older man's sneer faltered. He looked at the hard, uncompromising line of Dooley's jaw, and then he looked at Chantal. He was looking for the lie, for the transaction. But Chantal wasn't acting anymore. She was holding on to Dooley's hand like it was the only real thing in the room, her chest heaving, staring back at Pendleton with a fierce, terrified defiance. Pendleton swallowed hard. The color drained from his thin face. He picked up a gold fountain pen. The nib scratched against the thick paper. 3 pages. 3 signatures. "It's done," Pendleton whispered, pushing the leather folio across the desk. Dooley didn't look at the papers. He looked at Paul, who stepped out from the hallway, picked up the folio, and checked the signatures. Paul gave a single, sharp nod. "Enjoy your retirement, Arthur," Dooley said. He turned and walked Chantal out of the room. Then they didn't speak in the hallway. They didn't speak on the stairs. They walked out the front doors into the freezing night air, leaving the gala, leaving the lie behind them. The doors of the town car closed, shutting out the world. Chantal collapsed against the leather seat. The adrenaline vanished, leaving her entirely hollow. She was shaking. Dooley unbuttoned his jacket. He turned to her in the dim light of the cabin. "The money is yours," he said quietly. "The contract is fulfilled." Chantal looked down at her left hand. The sapphire ring felt impossibly heavy. She reached over, gripped the cold metal, and slowly slid it off her finger. She held it out to him. Dooley stared at the ring resting in her palm. He didn't move to take it. For a fraction of a second, she thought he might refuse. Then he reached out, his rough fingers brushing against her skin, and took the ring. "Thank you, Dooley," Chantal whispered, looking out the window into the dark. "Goodbye, Chantal," he said. 3 weeks later, the silence in Chantal's new life was deafening. The $200,000 had changed everything, exactly as promised. She and Leo had moved into the 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. The heat worked. The fridge was full of fresh produce. She had quit the diner, enrolled Leo in a highly rated preschool, and finally caught up on 3 years of lost sleep. It was a good life. It was safe. And she hated it. Every time a heavy car drove past the window, she checked the street. Every time a man in a dark suit walked into the grocery store, her breath hitched. She missed the sharp, dangerous scent of cedar and gunpowder. She missed the heavy weight of a man who looked at her like she was the only real thing in a room full of ghosts. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was the color of bruised iron, threatening rain. Chantal was sitting on a bench in the neighborhood park, watching Leo furiously dig a hole in the sandbox. The air shifted. Chantal didn't need to look up. Her nervous system recognized the atmospheric pressure change instantly. She turned her head. Dooley was standing 10 feet away near the edge of the playground. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore dark jeans, heavy boots, and a charcoal sweater that made his shoulders look impossibly broad. He had his hands shoved into his pockets, watching her. He looked entirely out of place among the swings and colorful slides. A wolf standing in a playground. Chantal stood up. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She walked over to him, stopping a few feet away. "Pendleton signed," Chantal said, her voice tight. "The deal is done. You don't have to check on me." "I'm not checking on you," Dooley said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in days. "Then why are you here?" Dooley pulled his hands out of his pockets. He looked down at the rubber playground mat, then back up to her face. The absolute, terrifying control he usually wielded was gone. He looked grounded. He looked painfully human. "Because I bought a logistics company to go legitimate," Dooley said quietly. "I restructured the syndicate. I put Paul in charge of the street operations. I built a clean ledger. I did exactly what I set out to do." "Congratulations." "I hate it," he stated bluntly. "I sit in a glass office. I look at the clean ledger, and the only thing I can think about is a woman who fixed my arm on a kitchen stool and refused my money." Chantal stopped breathing. She stared at him, afraid to move, afraid to break the fragile reality forming between them. "The contract is over, Chantal," Dooley said, stepping closer. The scent of him, soap and cedar, washed over her. The lie is dead. Pendleton is gone. Nobody is watching. Then what is this? She whispered. This is me, asking, he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his hand. He didn't have the velvet box. He just held the sapphire ring between his thumb and forefinger. No leverage, no debts, no mafia shootouts. Just a man asking a woman to dinner. Chantal looked at the ring. Then she looked at the man holding it, the hard lines of his face, the scar on his brow, the flat, dark eyes that were suddenly filled with a terrifying, desperate hope. Over in the sandbox, Leo let out a triumphant yell, holding up a plastic shovel full of dirt. Dooley glanced at the boy, the ghost of a smile touching his lips, before looking back at Chantal. I can't promise it will be safe, Dooley murmured, closing the distance between them until his chest almost brushed hers. But I promise you'll never sit alone at a table again. Chantal looked up into his eyes. The cynicism that had protected her for years quietly dissolved, leaving behind something raw and fiercely beating. She didn't take the ring. Instead, she reached out and rested her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. It was beating fast. Dinner, Chantal said, a slow, genuine smile finally breaking across her face. But I'm picking the restaurant, and you're paying. Dooley let out a low, rough laugh that sounded like a physical relief. He dropped the ring back into his pocket, bringing his hand up to cup her jaw, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. Deal, he breathed. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a gritty, grounded romance. Did Chantal make the right choice trusting Dooley, or is she playing with fire? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on our next thrilling story. Your support helps us bring more of these dark, emotional tales to life.